Hey, welcome everyone to our last border migration seminar of the spring semester of 2021. As you may already know, the Border Migration Lab is a new initiative that we launched at the Mosbacher Institute last year that has the objective of producing rigorous research on the origins and impacts of migration, economic border flows, and cultural integration, and of course, enhancing evidence-driven policymaking and community engagement. We're promoting multidisciplinary research to achieve these objectives, and we're really thrilled to have affiliated faculty from across campus, including sociology, political science, economics, law, and others. This seminar series is a space that we created at the Border Migrations Lab in the Mosbacher Institute to provide our affiliated faculty with the opportunity to present their research and receive feedback from our network of friends. These seminars have been truly an inspiration for many of us. As this is an interdisciplinary group, we have had the opportunity to learn from different disciplines, appreciating different perspectives, and discovering new methods. We hope all these engagements will lead to more interdisciplinary research to study migration, which is obviously, as you know, a highly complex multidisciplinary phenomenon. In fact, I have the pleasure of being part of a multidisciplinary group of scholars from law, economics, sociology, and statistics, some of whom have already joined us here today, to study the impact of COVID-19 on the demand for immigrant labor in the United States. We have really interesting preliminary findings from a pilot survey that we did that includes interviews and survey forms, and we're expanding this analysis of existing data to estimate the overall impacts. Our speaker today is part of this group, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you today. It has been a real pleasure working with Ernesto Amaral on this project, and I'm very much looking forward to his presentation today on factors associated with internal migration at the local level in the United States. Given my experience with Ernesto, I know that we will learn a lot today from his impressive knowledge on census and other population data in the US. Just to tell you a little bit about him before he begins, he's an associate professor in the sociology department at Texas A&M University. His research is related to social demography, migration, and public policy analysis. His teaching interests include demography, migration, methods in social statistics, and public policy analysis. Prior to joining Texas A&M, Ernesto was an associate sociologist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School from 2014 to 2017. He was an associate professor in the political science department at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil from 2009 to 2014, and he received his PhD in sociology with a concentration in demography from the University of Texas at Austin in 2007, a master's degree from UFMG in 2002, and a bachelor's degree in social sciences also in Brazil in 2000. He's not only a great academic and a really smart person, but also someone I'm lucky to call my friend. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ernesto. Ernesto.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Raymond. I really appreciate it. And thank you, and also I'd like to thank Vivian for the opportunity to share this work here with you. So I will just share my screen right now to have these slides here. So you can see it, right? So thank you very much. Like, as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about this ongoing project about factors associated with internal migration at the local level here in the US. And I'm doing this project with two graduate students, Shi-Ken Yang and Jin-Chu Ran, who are also in the room here right now. So it has been a really interesting and pleasure project working with them here. And what's our main objective in this project? There are several studies that have been describing associations of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics with internal migration rates in the US. But there is less focus on the profile and spatial distributions of internal migrants within the US. Whenever we're talking about internal migration in the US, we usually hear more information about people moving between states or between regions, major regions in the US, but with a less focus on smaller areas. So our goal here is to first investigate factors associated with internal migration in recent years, and also do some analysis about local indicators of spatial association to understand clusters of internal migration within the US for smaller areas in the country. This project, overall, we also aim to estimate international migration patterns to the US, like where international migrants are moving into local areas in the US. But the presentation today here, I'm going to focus on internal migrants. And then at the end, I'm going to show you some research agenda that I have and projects that we aim to conduct in these next months and years. So in terms of internal migration, the US has been experiencing the lowest levels of internal migration since the late 1940s. So just to give an idea, between 1950 and 1960, around 20% of the population would move from like within, comparing the time of the interview and 1 year before the interview. And by 2019, we reached a level below 10%. So these are estimates from the demographer William Frey, and he kind of discussing how this internal migration within the US has been declining a lot in these more recent decades. And some work by Molloy and his colleagues, and also Moretti, mentioned that migration rates within the US, internal migration rates within the US, are higher for people with higher levels of education, for whites, African Americans, also for people that live in households without children, and people who lived in rental houses and those who are unemployed, exactly because they would be more likely to look for jobs, or also they are not so tied to that specific household where they live. And in order to try to understand why internal migration has been declining in these more recent years, William Frey tried to provide some explanations about that. So back in 1950 and 1960, the US economy was more robust in terms of job opportunities for people in different parts of the country. So people would migrate more within the country and looking for job opportunities. And in more recent decades, he points to some factors that are contributing to the decline in internal migration in the US. First, older people tend to have lower chances of migrating because they have a more stable life, they have already maybe even retired, so they're less likely to move away. And exactly because lower fertility rates and lower mortality rates, you have an aging population in the US, higher proportion of people in older ages. So an older population as a whole here in the US, you're going to have fewer chances of people overall moving within the country. And also the labor market has been more homogeneous across the country, so we can find good jobs or whatever jobs we want in different areas of the country, so we don't have to move away so much anymore compared to previous decades. And these two last topics that he mentions, it's interesting, and see that he wrote this short article in 2019, and he mentioned at that time that telecommuting and jobs from home were actually contributing for people to not migrate as much. And he also mentioned that the 2008 economic recession made people stay more put where they were, so they were less likely to migrate to other areas. And that's really interesting for us right now during the pandemic, because exactly because the nature of the pandemic, we are now telecommuting and we are doing jobs from home. We are having this Zoom presentation here, all these different things that, okay, some of them were already available before, but they are much more spread out right now. And the pandemic is causing much harder hit on the economy in terms of increase in unemployment rates, declining wages, than the economic recession. So what we expect for the next year is that the pandemic is going to influence internal migration rates in a negative way, will make internal migration rates decline even further. And it was interesting that in this article, he was speculating that maybe internal migration rates could bounce up from 10% now to 12%, but probably we are not going to see that exactly because of the pandemic and exactly because all these different ways that we do work right now have been much more spread in all different occupations in the country. And in terms of the neoclassical theory emphasizes that people move to places with more job opportunities, but overall, looking at data for the US, fewer people are changing jobs right now, which seems to be related with the decline of internal migration. So people are changing less jobs right now. People don't move so much across jobs in the US as we had in the past. And that, of course, is associated in some way with internal migration. And there is another line of study that kind of like tried to understand the effect of these economic shocks of the economy on internal migration flows. And there are studies focusing exactly on the effects of the 2008 economic recession on internal migration in the US. And this work by Cadena and Kovac mentioned that low-skilled Mexican immigrants were more responsive to the 2008 economic crisis than low-skilled US-born workers. So they pretty much mentioned that the relocation of immigrants within the US diminished spatial differences between local labor markets. So what happened was that in areas that were hit by the 2008 economic crisis and experienced really increases in unemployment rate, and if those areas had a high percentage of foreign-born population, this foreign-born population was more likely to move to other areas within the US because of the economic shock. And because of that, the US-born population living in those areas, they did not experience so much of the negative effect of the 2008 economic crisis. So the low-skilled US-born workers that lived in areas with many Mexican immigrants, they were shielded from the crisis because those areas with higher proportion of low-skilled Mexican immigrants, they were more likely to move to other areas in the US, and then the ones left behind, which were usually more US-born and low-skilled workers, they were not so negatively affected by the economic recession. So you see that the patterns of internal migration, they vary by nativity. They vary by whether people are US-born or foreign-born. In terms of social networks, Motel and Patton, they discussed that communities with large proportions of Mexican immigrants are more likely to facilitate the flexibility of these groups in the labor market. So areas that have larger proportion of Mexican immigrants, you verify what Cadena and Kovac saw, that in terms of recession, these people tend to move away, but they have some more knowledge about job opportunities in that area, exactly because of their social networks, knowing more people, knowing more, having friends and family around, so they can better get a sense of job opportunities for that. And for these specific analysis here, we will analyze spatial distributions of internal migrants using the 2005 to 2019 American Community Surveys. So of course, we cannot see the impacts of the current pandemic on internal migration. So the 2000 American Community Survey, 2020 American Community Survey might be available by the end of this year. And then by the end of next year, we're going to have the 2021 ACS. So those new years will provide us a sense of how the pandemic is affecting internal migration, but we don't have that data available yet. And for this specific analysis, we are using public available data. And in terms of like what we are considering internal migrants, we have the information about the current residents and the areas of destination, which is like where the people live at the time of the interview. With public available data, we have information on the public use microdata areas where they live, or they are called PUMAs. And PUMAs, in some cases, they can be groups of counties. In other cases, they can be subdivisions of counties. And this is the lowest level of geographic aggregation available in public data. And they have around 100,000 people living on each one of these PUMAs. And what the Census Bureau does is like they group some of the counties to have at least 100,000 residents in order to don't have issues of confidentiality. Because since this is all public available data, if we could know information of people within really small areas, we could maybe identify those people. So that's just a strategy to deal with issues of confidentiality. And in terms of areas of previous residence, in ACS, we know where the person lived at the time of the American Community Survey, but also the information about 1 year before. So that's the information about previous residents. And this data relates to the pool of residents 1 year before. But again, for confidentiality issues, sometimes what the Census Bureau does is that areas that people moved in 1 year before that are small in population, they group those areas and they call this group of pumas as MIG pumas. And so again, it's this group of areas with small population. It's just a strategy to deal with confidentiality issues. So what did we do at the end? We grouped the pumas of destination in the same geographical level as the areas of previous residence, the MIG pumas. So we have 2,378 pumas of current residents on the more recent census. And then we group them into the same level as the areas of previous residents that we have 1,005 MIG pumas. So we are pretty much subdividing the US in 1,005 areas, and we look at people migrating from all these areas among themselves from the time of 1 year before the survey to the time of the survey. So here it was just a strategy to homogenize the areas of previous and current residents, so we have the same geographic aggregation 1 year before and the time of the survey. And so this is just to show our subdivisions. We have the states in red, and the MIG pumas that we are using are in black here. So you see, for example, in the state of Nevada, you have a big MIG puma here, exactly because the population being smaller, you have to aggregate all these different areas. And the blue ones are the pumas. So in some cases, we had to group series of pumas into these MIG pumas. And overall, like I said before, we have 1,005 MIG pumas in the country, and we look at internal migration between them. The migration status then, we are analyzing internal migrants, those who resided in another puma or MIG puma 1 year before the survey, and non-migrants are those who resided in the same areas, in the same area in the previous year. But in the data, we also have information about internal migrants, who are those who reside in another country 1 year before the survey. For this specific exercise here, we are not including international migrants, people who were in another country and came to the US within the last year. And they are around only like 0.5% per year of the ACS. But here, both in terms of non-migrants and internal migrants, we can have previous international migrants. So we do have foreign-born people in these two groups. This might be people who were born in another country and moved to the US several years ago. And then we also know whether they migrated again within the US in the last year or if they did not migrate. So foreign-born population is still included here, but those are people that moved to the US more than 1 year before the survey. So I'm going to pretty much show you two sets of results. First, we estimate factors associated with internal migration flows in the US using the 2005 to 19 ACS. We are pretty much estimating logistic models for the dependent variable, the binary dependent variable, informing whether the person is internal migrant or non-migrant. And the sample size in ACS is huge, more than 36 million people. And here, even considering only people with at least 18 years of age, because for people with at least 18 years of age, we have information about occupation and other data that we don't have for children. So the sample size is really big in our case here. And we also do an analysis of spatial distribution of the proportion of internal migrants in these MIG pumas across the country. And I'm going to show maps focusing only on the 2019 ACS, and we are focusing on their concentration based on the area of destination, where they are living right now. And I'm going to show you results of estimations of these local indicators of spatial association, LISA, that I'm going to mention in more detail in the following slides. So the first group of analysis, we estimated several logistic regressions, trying to understand what are the chances of someone being an internal migrant or not. And we control these models for several independent variables: year of the ACS, sex of the individual, age group, education, marital status, citizenship, whether the person is foreign born or US born, race, ethnicity, if they have at least one child in the household, whether they own the house or if the house is rented, and region of residence 1 year ago. The overall region in the country, whether they live in West, Midwest, Northeast, or South region. And we also explore this interaction of nativity by race ethnicity. So here we look at US born people white, foreign born white, US born Hispanic, foreign born Hispanic, and so on. So we kind of like explore a little bit this interaction that was not done in previous studies. And for people with at least 18 years of age, we know whether they're in school or not, if they speak English, if they have any disability, their occupation and employment status, and if they are in the top 50% income range. We estimated several models. We estimated models separated by year. We estimated models separated by nativity, only for foreign born, only for US born. But here I'm going to show the results for one model only. And this one model only that I'm going to show the results in these next slides, it's controlling for all these variables, independent variables here. And I'm going to show the results for only the variables that are highlighted here in red. So all the models all the graphs that I'm going to show now come from the same model, and that's the model controlling for all these variables that you see on the screen. Okay. So in terms of the odds ratio of being an internal migrant by year, so that's the result of the year variable. We see that the chances of people being an internal migrant is being declining over time. How do you interpret that? For example, in 2010, people were 19% less likely to migrate within the US compared to 2005, which is our reference category. And in these more recent years, we have around 16% less chances of people migrating within the US comparing to 2005. And again, that's controlling for all those other independent variables that I showed before. And we are here only talking about people with at least 18 years of age. So we kind of see this decline of internal migration in these last years of the ACS, but it has been kind of like stable over time in these last few years, since 2005, 2014, 2015 until now. In terms of age group, we see that younger people, they are more likely to migrate. So people between 18 and 24 years of age are 1.5 times more likely to migrate than to internal migrate within the US than people between 25 to 44 years of age, controlling for all the other variables that we saw. And older people, those between 45 and 64, are 52% less likely to migrate compared to the reference group. And the same we see for the people with at least 65 years of age. Okay. In terms of education, as it was shown in previous studies, people with higher levels of education are more likely to migrate. Those with a college degree are 1.96 times more likely to migrate than people with less than high school. And people with graduate degree, they have 2.11 times more likely and more chance to migrate than those with less than high school. And in terms of citizenship and nativity, citizens, they're more likely to migrate than non-citizens, but the magnitude of that effect is really small. It's only 7% times more, 7% more likely to migrate than non-citizens. And foreign born, they are 10% less likely to migrate than US-born people. So that's an interesting thing if we look at the Cadena and Kovacs study. The Cadena and Kovacs study mentioned that after the economic recession, foreign-born people, they were more likely to migrate to other areas within the US if before they were living in areas that were hit by the economic crisis really hard in terms of unemployment rates increasing a lot. But overall, what we see is that the foreign-born population is less likely to migrate than the US-born population. So it's going to be interesting to see with the new ACS in 2020 and 2021, when they become available, how the pandemic might have affected that. And let's see. And in terms of the our interaction, sorry, this one is only the race ethnicity. African Americans and Hispanic, they are around 30% less likely to migrate than the white population, and Asians and Native Americans less likely to migrate than whites, but the magnitude is not so high here. And the interaction that we did of nativity and race ethnicity, and taking the US-born white population as the reference, we see that the other groups tend to have lower chances of migrating, maybe exactly because the US-born white population, they have more knowledge of job opportunities in the country, they have more links, more social networks, and that make them more likely to migrate. And for example, the US-born Hispanic population is 38% less likely to migrate than the US-born white, and the foreign-born Hispanic is actually 41% less likely to migrate than the US-born white population, right? So you kind of see these different patterns there. And now the second part of the analysis in the spatial association analysis, we recognize that people are not randomly distributed over space. And we estimate these local indicators of spatial association that identifies local clusters and spatial outliers. And it estimates the contribution of each one of these areas. And by neighbors here, we classify areas that share the same border, like in queen contiguity, like all the areas that share the same border to each one of our MIG pumas. And then we analyze the concentration of internal migrants in the areas of destination in the US. And we pretty much look at these distributions and we divide in these four groups. The spatial clusters are areas with high levels of the specific indicator we are analyzing, surrounded by areas with high levels of that same indicator. Another spatial cluster is known as the low-low, areas with low levels of the indicator surrounded by low levels. And the spatial outliers are, for example, areas that have high levels of internal migrants surrounded by areas with low levels of internal migrants. And areas with low levels of internal migrants surrounded by high is the other spatial outlier subgroup that is called here the low-high. And these are the same colors that I'm going to show in the following maps. So just to explain, this is the proportion of internal migrants in each one of the MIG pumas in the US based on the 2019 ACS. And when we look at this map, we kind of have an idea that maybe you have higher concentration of internal migrants in those areas, but it's hard to see exactly where it is. The local indicator of spatial association kind of shows us areas where you have higher chances of higher levels of internal migrants surrounded by high levels of internal migrants. That's the high cluster. And then you see low levels of internal migration surrounded by low levels of internal migration. So you see that Utah, Texas, Florida, and some areas here in the East Coast have the highest levels of internal migration in the country. And the areas in dark blue are the areas that have lower levels of internal migration surrounded by low levels. And what we try to do now is break this map for subgroups of the population that interest us. So in this map here, on the left, we see information for known migrants, US-born known migrants and foreign-born known migrants. And what's interesting about the US-born known migrants, because in these areas here, that like Midwestern areas and even southern areas that were hit a lot by the economic recession, and they still have issues because of declining jobs in manufacturing industry, you have a lot of people that do not leave those areas. So the red areas here are areas with high levels of known migrants born in the US, surrounded by high levels of non-migrants born in the US. And the foreign-born non-migrants, they are usually more located close to the southern border and also in Florida and New Jersey and New York. And in terms of internal migrants, this map here is a little similar to the one that we saw before for the overall population of internal migrants, because the US-born internal migrants compose most of those. So that's pretty much like similar to what we saw before. But for the foreign-born internal migrants, we see a little different pattern that they tend to migrate after they are in the US. Based information about the previous year, they are more likely to migrate to California, Texas, and Florida, and really not likely to migrate to all these areas highlighted in dark blue, which is exactly the opposite of the US-born non-migrants. And breaking this down by race ethnicity, and all these maps here now are only for internal migrants. Non-Hispanic whites, really low levels of migration within the US to areas close to the southern borders, and higher levels to these northwestern areas. For the non-Hispanic African-American population, it's really interesting, this map to me, because it just shows really low levels of migration of the non-Hispanic African-American population to several areas in the country. And we had the great migration between 1910 and 1950 of African-Americans moving from the south to the north. And what you see now is people going back to the southern areas, so we have higher levels of them concentrated here. The Hispanic population, and this is not breaking by nativity, so we're not talking about whether they are born in the US or not. But Hispanics, when they move, they tend to move to California, to Texas, and exactly two states that are closer to the southern border, and really low levels of migration to more Midwestern areas here. And the non-Hispanic Native Americans, they are more likely to migrate usually to states that have more reservations. So that's expected as well. It kind of like shows different patterns of internal migration by race ethnicity in the country. So summarizing, the factors associated with migration rates are similar to previous findings. In terms of neoclassical theory, people move to areas with more jobs, and areas in Midwest with economic issues still have high concentrations of non-migrants. So that's counterintuitive. So these might be older people that they're losing their job, they're experiencing economic issues, but they're not moving away. In terms of social networks, spatial patterns of internal migration vary for different nativity and race ethnicity groups, as I shown with the previous maps. Areas with large proportions of specific race ethnicity groups, such as Hispanic or Native Americans, are attracting more of these groups, and African Americans as well. In terms of the next steps in our research agenda, we will continue this analysis and analyzing not only the American Community Survey, but the decennial censuses. And we will analyze restricted data at the Texas Research Data Center here at A&M. That's one of the restricted data centers available in the country. And in this case, it's going to be more interesting because we can break down by county of residence, not only PUMA of residence. With restricted data, we can do this analysis of people moving from one county to another, not just between MIG PUMAs. And we also plan to estimate these autoregressive spatial models. And just to explain really quickly here, like there's two strategies. We will take into account spatial dependence, which is the influence of neighboring areas at origin and destination, the likelihood of migration, that our maps show that that's important. So we're gonna take that into account to put in our spatial models. And because we have so small sample size when we break down migrants for these small areas, it's good to use a Bayesian statistics approach in which we can use our prior knowledge based on other data sources and historical trends in order to tell the statistical software what we think we will look like, and then analyze the data and get the final result. So just one slide about each of them. What is exactly spatial dependence? We have migration from areas of origin and destination, and that's what we saw in our logistic models. But we also know that areas surrounding the origin, they also influence the chances of people moving to that same area of destination. And the areas surrounding the destination also have similar patterns as the destination itself in terms of people coming from that same area of origin. And also we have to take into account that both areas of the neighboring areas of origin and destination also contribute to this overall level of migration between these two specific areas. So our models will try to take into account all these different factors that are influencing migration. In this case, internal migration in the US. In terms of the Bayesian statistics approach, we so far we analyzed the ACS, but like I said, when we break down by a lot of like subgroups of the population, we might not have enough sample size. So one idea is to use IRS data that has a much larger sample size. It doesn't have really demographic characteristics of the population, but we have information about millions and millions of households. Based on that information, we can have a general idea of internal migration in the country and use that information as a prior knowledge in order to estimate these Bayesian models and then analyze ACS data to get more reliable estimates. So we have like a long research agenda here to be developed in these next years. We also, the census just recently linked decennial census to the ACS, so we can exploit that longitudinal analysis. And some recent data about the Great Migration shows that African Americans that moved decades ago from the south to the north of the US, their children experience intergenerational mobility. So that's the kind of analysis that we can do. And after we analyze, we estimate better migration flows, we can see how migration affects several different outcomes, labor, health, and education outcomes. We can try to integrate external data sources, explore more the Mexico-US migration because we have more data on this. And we can also think even about some policy simulations, really policy simulations based on data, not based on ideology. And also simulate future migration flows using different hypothetical scenarios. So this research agenda here is for years to come. And I just want to show the final two slides, one about possibilities of using external data sources, and the other one about the focus on Mexico-US migration. In terms of linking external data sources, the idea is to combine textual data with demographic data with machine learning methods. So it's pretty much trying to get data from other sources, not only the Census Bureau, but in order to link that data, we're going to have to use these machine learning methods to link this big data into the large data sets from the census. So overall, the idea is to integrate data from social media, textual archives, private companies' data to Census Bureau data sets. And these more traditional data sets have the advantage of providing representative samples at the national, state, and local levels. But information from all these other sources, they tend to be more up to date because they're happening right now in a continuous basis. So if you can link that data that's being created in a continuous basis with this more traditional data, that improves our knowledge about that specific problem. And in terms of specifically about the Mexico-US migration, so far here, we analyzed data from the American Community Survey and also the decennial census to see where people are migrating to based on their individual, household, and contextual characteristics. We can also include distance between areas. And as I mentioned with that diagram about spatial dependence, we can also include this information about neighboring areas of origin and destination. But what's interesting about the Mexico-US migration is that we have other sources of data that were collected in the communities of origin. So we have the Mexican Migration Project, the Mexican Family Life Survey, that collect information about people back in Mexico, and then we can estimate the chances of Mexicans coming to the US, the likelihood of them moving here, also controlling for a series of different variables, and also controlling for the differentials between the US and Mexican areas. And based on that data, we have the information about the likelihood of people migrating to the US. And conditional being migrant, we can use ACS and census to know where they are coming to the US. And based on that, we can do some simulation models to try to project what's going to be in the future. And that's here where we can also do those policy simulations. If we implement a specific policy simulation, how that would affect the likelihood of migration and the destination of migrants. And of course, we would have to do these simulations, but kind of look at the real data to see if our simulations are reliable or not. Cool. So these are all different ideas for research that we are trying to do in the future. And the Borders and Migration Lab here at Texas A&M, it's a great place to conduct this research, and I'm really excited about these opportunities. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was really outstanding as always, Ernesto. I'm going to let you kind of facilitate questions if they come in either on the chat or because we have a smaller group, if anyone wants to jump in. Can I just start off with a question though? I mean, I actually have like 3 that I wrote down. I mean, your presentation is very thought-provoking. But one of them is at the beginning of your talk, right? You said essentially, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify, but the internal migration decisions could be driven by either sort of local factors like economic conditions that would be pull factors, right? Kind of these economic pull factors. Another option that has emerged a lot in the literature has been social networks, right? And so you see that kind of inconsistent with this motel and patent analysis that there has been additional sorting based on demographic characteristics, if that's a fair characterization. So my question to you, my main question, I have a couple others, but my main question is, did you get a sense of why we've sort of seen kind of more of the sorting, or what role the local economic conditions are playing? Or do you think it's really dominated by networks and demographic sorting? Do you have a sense of that yet?
I mean, based on those maps that we saw, it's the social networks in terms of race, ethnicity, composition of the areas play a major role. And that's why I think the spatial dependence models. So what we are trying to do with the spatial models will be to link the 2 exercises that I did so far. Get the logistic regression that we control for all the individual variables and merge with the maps. And because those are showing that exactly like Hispanics, they are moving more to areas where we have more Hispanics. Native Americans, the same thing. African Americans, the same thing. So far, we see social networks playing a major role, but I have to be honest that we did not include information about unemployment rates or economic indicators at the local level. We did not do the exercise that Caden and Kovac did. And I think that's going to be a major improvement of the models to include those because of the pandemic. Right, and I think in this next years it's going to be interesting to control for that as well. But that's so my answer to you would be social networks matter, but probably also the labor component of it as well. But we did not do that exercise yet. You're on mute.
Unless anyone else wants to jump in, can I just sneak in another question real quick? And while people might be gathering their thoughts. So one of the other changes in migration that we've seen over your time frame, which is essentially the last 20 years, has been a real change in the source country, right? So in 2000, or the beginning of the 2000s, obviously Mexico was the largest sending country, right? But by 2015, 2016, 17, Mexico, I think, was surpassed by China and India, right? So does the change in the source country play a role in the amount of native migration, particularly of the foreign born, do you think? Like, can we kind of break it down by, do Chinese and people from India, Asian India, do they, right, have more concentrated social networks that would lead to like less internal migration? Or do you think, what kind of role has the change in sending country played in the change in domestic internal migration?
No, that's a great point. I mean, we can break foreign-born population by year about whether they are from Mexico or from India and China, and I think we would have enough sample size in that case because there are so many immigrants from those countries. I would expect what you just said, like in terms of foreign-born population, they respond to these economic shocks more in a more timely manner. But at the same time, they have fewer social networks than the US-born white population. So overall, they migrate less. But Mexicans, they have like the stock of Mexicans in the US is really high. Okay, the latest flows, they're small, but the overall stock is really big. And so they know a lot of people, and they know people in other areas in the country. I mean, they might know, that's the chance of knowing, the likelihood of knowing is higher. So they have a little bit more flexibility to move. On the other hand, Indians and Chinese, they have been coming here forever, but in more recent years, these levels have been increasing, but it's still the concentration or the stock of Indians and Chinese is much lower than Mexicans. So I would say that they would be less likely to internally migrate. That would be my hypothesis. And I also think that overall Mexicans would be more likely to internally migrate than the average of all foreign-born. So, but yes, we can do this exercise. That's a great suggestion, but we have not done so far, of breaking by country of origin.
Carol Goldsmith has a question in the chat about whether or not you've looked into local factors such as policing immigration status or IC activities kind of in relation to internal migration. And I know that Huyen's on the call as well, and this is also the area that she's been working at. But it's Ernesto's show today, right? So we'll let Ernesto answer the question.
No, we have not. We have not looked at that kind of data. I mean, I would be interested to see if that kind of information we can have at the level that we are doing the analysis. Maybe it's not going to be available at the PUMA or MIG-PUM or county level. And maybe like Huyen, you're going to know much more than I know, like Raymond just said. But if we have that information for the local areas, we could link ICE activities and even like different state laws, right? Like variations in state laws and how that is affecting migration to that specific state. And if you have that information for specific county laws as well, if that would exist, that variation makes sense, we could also estimate that. But the answer is no, we have not looked at this so far.
I'm happy to go ahead, Vivian.
Yeah, I just have a quick question, and I don't know if you've looked into this, but if I understood correctly, your models capture whether someone has moved like in the recent or the last year. Do you have any measurement of how many times people move? I mean, I don't know if these movements are, like they arrive, thinking about the foreign-born, they arrive to one place and then like they just arrive and then they move to another place and then they just, like establish themselves there. Or in the same vein, like whether, natives move like quite often. Do you have any sense of whether these different populations tend to move more often rather than just moving once, but whether they're like constantly on the move?
Yeah, I did not look at this specifically, but like based on this analysis that we did, I would say that the US-born population tends to move more overall throughout their lives than the foreign-born population. The Census Bureau estimates that overall, for everybody, US-born and foreign-born, people move on average 12 times per year within the US, and that's considering county as the boundary, the geographic boundary. But of course, those numbers vary a lot by subgroup, but I did not look specifically with this data how many times, because this data is not longitudinal, right? I mean, and it's we don't have the information about how many times the person left. We have the information about state of birth or country of birth, and we know which MIG-PUMA the person lived 1 year before. But we don't know much more than that in terms of how many times they moved throughout their lives. That information is not available here. Yeah. Maybe one source of data that would provide that would be IRS data, Internal Revenue Service, because then you can link people through time through their social security number. And then you could see if the same people moved across.
Yeah.
but then you don't have the social demographic characteristics as we have in ACS. So
yeah.
But those are the estimates for the overall internal migration flows by Census Bureau. But I mean, with this data, we cannot have that kind of estimation.
Thank you. I think we had a question.
Julian, I saw you raised your hand, and I just want to give you an opportunity to jump in if you wanted. You're on mute, though.
I think she's right.
Oh. Oh, she can't unmute herself.
Now I can.
Oh.
Ernesto, thanks really for a really great presentation. I learned a lot, and I was particularly struck by your slide showing migration patterns, internal migration patterns based on race, ethnicity, right? And the very distinct patterns based, African Americans moving to the South and Hispanics moving toward the, I guess, the Southwest, the border states. And I have this question, I guess, following up on what Raymond asked, which is, when we think about social networks, is the understanding is that social networks are based on race and or ethnicity? And if so, does the social network effect lessen as people become, for people with higher education levels? And I didn't know if there's any way to sort of test that with your data. I guess intuitively, I think as we become more educated, our social networks extend beyond our own ethnic, racial communities. And I'm wondering if there was some way to explore that with your data.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. Like, what is social network, right? I mean, if you look at the Mexican Migration Project, they have really specific questions about like what are the linkages of Mexicans with people here? Like if they have a relative that moved here, if they have a spouse, a child, if they have friends that live in the US already. So you have all the specifics. I agree with you that our measure, I mean, of social network is limited in the sense that's kind of like proportion of race, ethnicity. And I think we can do what you are suggesting in the sense that if we link our models that have the information about the individual education and the proportion of people with my same race, ethnicity in that area, then we are pretty much controlling for everything.
Yeah.
But that's what we have not done yet. So it's
because I think the finding either way would be interesting, right?
Yeah, because you would be controlling by people who live in the same area, like let's say two people with the same race ethnicity live in the same area, so has the same race ethnicity composition, one more educated than the other who is more likely to migrate. So we have data for that.
Yeah, and also where they migrate, right? Yeah. Because I thought your map was really striking because it wasn't necessarily lining up with economic opportunities, right? The states with the highest growth. They kind of really, the contrast was very stark. So I was curious to see whether educational level might have.
I agree with you. I agree with you that education plays a major role in the sense of expanding your social networks. And I mean, a clear example is us in academia, right, expanding so much social networks in terms of job opportunities. And those spatial models would allow us to do that because in the spatial models, we can control by individual, by the composition. And then as an outcome, we can have the predicted migration for each one of the areas, for each one of the subgroups of the population. So yes, that's possible to be done. And that's a really good suggestion. Thank you.
I mean, along those lines, if I could follow up while we're waiting for someone else to ask a question, because I have this weird aversion to dead air on Zoom calls. But that is that, a lot of those statistics you pointed out for the odds ratios for different demographic characteristics for age and whatever, it'd be really interesting because you have 35 million observations, right? You could get really precise estimates of those by year, right? To see if the effect of, education has changed over year, the effect of, demographic group, or the effect of, different occupational categories, right? I mean, because that's included, right? So to kind of really decompose the contribution of each of those demographic characteristics over time, I think would be fascinating.
Yeah, we estimated the models by year. And even it's funny because if with this data, if you have an odds ratio of 1.01, it's still significant, right? Because the sample size is so big. And the same thing, 0.99 is still significant. I agree with you. So, but we can break, and we did estimate models for each one of the years. And overall, for these major variables, age, education, and so on, the results did not change so much between 2005 and 2019, but it is an interesting result to see, and not only use odds ratio, but get some predicted values over time for each one of the age groups, for example. We can get a specific subgroup of the population and then varying just by age and looking at time, the predicted probability of internally migrating the country. So that could be an interesting graph to make.
Yeah, one of the other questions I had was, looking at that initial graph you put up about the change in internal migration over time. I mean, you kind of wonder if 2005 and 2006 weren't, for some reason, exceptional, right? And the rest of them, it was kind of a returning to the mean. Like, I don't know, like, you know what I mean? I don't know if there's any way to evaluate that, but clearly the outliers were 2005 and 2006, because there was those two, and then there was like basically everybody else, all the other years in which it was relatively constant. So I don't know if you thought about that at all, or what the literature has said about those years.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at that, when I heard all this discussion from the 2019, when ACS 2019 came out, that everybody was making a big deal of internal migration declining a lot. But when you look at the data in these last years, controlling for everything else, it doesn't change so much. So it's kind of like around 16% lower than in 2005. And controlling for all the other social demographic characteristics of people. But what's going to be interesting now in 2020 and 2021 ACS is to see if there is an oscillation there, controlling for all the variables. Because when you say, internal migration dropped from 20% in 1950 to 10% now, you're not considering a series of variables that are behind. That's the overall mean for the country. In that graph, we are considering these variables. And it's really stable. So people made a lot of noise in the media, but when you control a little bit by the variables, it's not bounces so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could obviously spend hours and hours, and I'm sure our other participants would love to spend more time with you. But to respect everyone's time, I would definitely want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially Ernesto for this amazing presentation. It's a great way with a bang, to end the semester and the academic year. And we would really hope that you would stay tuned and join us again in the fall. We'd love to continue this work because we think it's a critical issue, and we have a great team working on it. And other than that, I wish you all a very happy summer.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.